She sat down alone, looked at the carefully prepared script her advisors had placed in front of her, and pushed it aside completely. She completely refused to read whatever they wanted her to say about her son. She spoke in her own words about Prince Louis and the private recovery journey the family had been hiding for months. And here is where it gets deeply personal. The palace had stayed silent for so long that people began asking uncomfortable questions. Why were engagements being quietly rearranged? Why was the youngest prince simply nowhere to be seen? That silence was William's decision from the beginning. He believed protecting Louis was the only way to shield him from the kind of permanent scrutiny that follows royal children for life. Catherine understood that completely. But somewhere along the way, she came to a painful realization. The silence had stopped protecting Louis. It had started convincing him that his own family was ashamed of him. Music, and that is the detail that changes everything. So let's talk about how this all started, because honestly, it goes back much further than the moment Louis got sick. Long before that, William had already made up his mind about how illness in his family would be handled. He had decided that whatever happened, it would stay inside the family and music away from public view completely. To understand why he felt so strongly about that, you need to go back even further than that decision, all the way back to when William was a boy himself, watching his own mother get chased by cameras until the day she died. That memory never left William. It shaped the way he sees every single camera, every single reporter, and every single question about his family's private life. So, when Louis first started showing signs of a respiratory illness, William didn't see a sick child who needed rest and doctors. He saw a story waiting to be stolen the same way he felt music. His mother's story was stolen from her piece by piece until there was nothing left that was hers, music alone. So William gave one order. Nothing about Louis's condition leaves this household. No statements, no explanations, nothing. And for a while that order held. Lizzie quietly disappeared from the royal calendar, and aides were told to deflect any questions and change the subject fast. And they got good at it, too, redirecting reporters toward Princess Charlotte's latest school event or George's upcoming appearance. Anything that kept the conversation away, music from Louis. And for a while, it worked, at least on the surface. But here's the thing about secrets inside a royal household. They are never as sealed as the people at the top like to believe. There are simply too many people involved, too many hands that touch the schedule, and too many eyes that see the comings and goings of doctors who aren't music, supposed to be noticed. And this is where it gets interesting, because while William was busy locking down the story from the music outside, a crack was already forming from the inside, and nobody saw it coming. One of the junior aides handling Louis's schedule had a problem of their own. Something personal and completely unrelated to the Wales family, involving serious debt and pressure from people this aide could not afford to say no to. This wasn't someone who set out to betray the family. This was someone who got backed into a corner long before Louis ever got sick. Music. And once that corner closes in on you, the options start looking a lot thinner than they should. This particular aide had worked inside the household for years, trusted enough to handle private schedules and quiet arrangements, which is exactly why nobody thought to watch them closely, because this is the kind of relationship that starts small and only grows more dangerous the longer it goes unnoticed. It rarely announces itself and usually starts with something that feels harmless, a music passing comment confirmed, or a date checked. Nothing that feels like betrayal in the moment. But the door was open, even if it was just a crack. And that's honestly the scariest part of secrets like this. Music, they don't fail all at once. They fail quietly through someone nobody was watching. Someone who probably never wanted any of this in the first place. What makes this even harder to sit with music is that this aide genuinely cared about the family. That's what made the position so dangerous in the first place. Somebody who wanted to protect the household music could still end up being the exact reason it was exposed, simply because fear music works differently than loyalty does. Fear makes people quiet when they should speak up, and it makes them agree to things they would never agree to under normal circumstances. Nobody around this aide noticed anything music wrong, because on the surface nothing had changed. The work still got done. The schedule still ran on time. That's usually how these things stay hidden for so music long, because the damage doesn't show up in performance. It shows up later all at once when it's already too late to stop it quietly. Meanwhile, music inside the household, something else was happening. Something far more human than politics or leaks. Nobody had explained anything to George or Charlotte. Nobody sat them down and told them what was actually going on with their little brother. But children pick up more than adults think, music, and these two were no exception. The tension in a house has its own language, spoken in slammed doors that used to be left open, in hushed phone calls that stopped the second a child walked into the room, in a mother who smiled a little too carefully at breakfast. Both kids were starting to learn that language fast, even without a single word being said to them directly. And that kind of learning leaves a mark that music doesn't just disappear once the crisis is over. Meals grew quieter. Laughter, when it came at all, felt shorter than music used to. So by the end of this stretch, you had a palace convinced its silence was airtight. A family slowly cracking under the weight of what wasn't being said, and one small dangerous leak waiting to happen just beneath the surface. And yet underneath all of that tension, there was one piece of good news finally starting to take hold. Louis's health was slowly improving. And it was that improvement more than anything else that pushed William and Catherine to finally test the waters. So they arranged a private rehearsal at Windsor with no cameras and no crowds, just close family and a few trusted staff. This was a gentle trial run to see whether Louis was ready to step back into royal life at all. Everyone involved had agreed it would be low pressure, a handful of trusted staff and nothing more. Exactly the kind of soft re-entry William had been fighting for since Louis first got sick. Nobody expected it to become the most terrifying morning of Catherine Music and William's lives. Midway through, Lizzie stopped walking. He reached for his mother's hand and told her he couldn't catch his breath. And just like that, every careful plan the Music family had built collapsed in seconds. Because no amount of preparation can prepare a parent for the moment their child says those exact words. Catherine dropped to her knees immediately. William cleared the room, keeping only the medical team. And then he did something nobody expected, not even Music Catherine. Instead of asking a nanny or an aide to take George and Charlotte somewhere safe, William did it himself. He walked both children out by hand, speaking to them in a low, steady voice that gave nothing away, even though his own heart was pounding. That single choice tells you everything about what was going through his head at that moment. Because somewhere in William's memory is a boy who was shielded from his own mother's pain and told nothing, ushered out of rooms without explanation, left to guess and imagine the worst on his own. And here William was, without even realizing it, repeating that exact same pattern with his own children. Except this time, music. He told himself it was protection instead of exclusion, because that's what it always looks like from the inside. William would later admit he barely remembers walking them down that corridor at all, as if some older practice part of him had simply taken over. What the world will never hear officially is just how close that morning came to going a completely different way. Because once the immediate danger passed, a doctor pulled William aside, away from Catherine, and told him plainly that if they had waited even one more hour to act, this story could be ending very differently right now. This was not a warning meant to frighten him further. It was just the truth delivered quietly and directly the way doctors learned to deliver the hardest sentences of their careers. William carried that sentence alone for weeks. He never repeated it to Catherine in full, not because he wanted to hide it from her, but because he could not bring himself to hand her a fear that heavy while she was already drowning in her own. It felt like love in the moment, a husband trying to carry the worst of it so his wife wouldn't have to. But it would later become one more brick in a wall of silence that was slowly building between them. A wall neither of them meant to build, but both of them kept adding to anyway. Music, one unspoken fear at a time. And there's one more thing William admitted much later. Something that shows just how frightened he really was underneath that composed, decisive exterior everyone saw that day. Standing outside the room where his son was being treated, Music, William found himself praying. And it had been years since his mother's funeral since he had done that. Just think about that for a second. A future king trained his entire life to stay composed under pressure was reduced to praying in a hallway because he had absolutely no control over what happened next. Music, no title, no protocol, and no amount of authority could fix what was happening behind that door. That was the moment that should have taught this family that silence has limits, that some fears are too big to carry alone, no matter how strong you're supposed to be. Music, instead, it taught them the opposite. And that mistake is exactly what pushed George and Charlotte into a corner. Nobody was watching closely enough. If the last chapter belonged to the parents, then this one belongs to George and Charlotte. And honestly, music, it might be the part of this story that hits hardest. Unable to reconcile the polished palace draft with everything her family had actually lived through, Catherine sat down after the children had gone to bed one night and wrote her own statement by hand. She worked through several drafts before she found words that actually matched what her family had survived. She then placed her version right next to the official one, and the contrast between the two said everything before either of them spoke a word. One was careful and distant. The other was raw and true. Music, William read the opening line of Catherine's version and immediately shook his head. He bluntly told her that one public statement could be replayed and picked apart for years after their son had fully recovered. He said words spoken once in a moment of emotion have a way of following a person forever. But underneath William's anger was that same old fear of losing control of his family story. Music, the way it was taken from his mother decades ago, piece by piece until there was nothing private left at all. He reminded Catherine almost desperately music, that the press had never once given his own family the benefit of the doubt, music, and he saw no reason they would start now. Then, right in the middle of that argument, William's phone rang, and he was informed that the tabloid connected to the earlier leak was not waiting for the palace to make a decision. They were going ahead with their own story regardless, and time had officially run out. William was shown a mock-up of the headline they had already prepared. It painted the family's silence as neglect, music, as if Louis vanishing from public life meant he had been abandoned rather than protected. That headline was built to sell papers by making a frightened family look like a careless one. And that music, more than anything Catherine had set up to that point, is what finally broke William's resistance. Music, just think about the cruelty of that for a second. The very silence he built to protect his son, music, was about to hand that same story to someone who would tell it far more brutally than his wife ever would. Like that wasn't enough heartbreak already. Catherine told William what Louis himself had actually asked for. Music. He wanted George and Charlotte to know their quiet support meant something, that their jokes and their late nights outside his door had not gone unnoticed. And more than anything, Lizzie did not want people thinking he had disappeared because he was not brave enough to face them. Music. William sat down and covered his face. He then admitted something he had never said out loud before, that his decisions had been driven just as much by his own fear of losing control, music, as by any real instinct to protect his son. That admission cost him something to say, but there was still one more approval standing in the way, and that belonged to King Charles. When the draft reached him, he read it twice. When he got to the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, something in him shifted, because Charles carries his own quiet regret too. Music. He has spent years thinking about how much was hidden from his own generation during the Diana years. Music. How silence back then was mistaken for protection, and how that silence did not end well for anyone. It was a lesson he had hoped never to relive with his own grandchildren. So he rejected the sanitized version completely, music, and plainly told William that a statement with Louis's own words stripped out would protect the institution while failing the boy at the center of it. Charles's condition was simple and non-negotiable. Lizzie had to hear every single word first and understand, music, exactly what the world was about to learn about him. When Catherine read it to Louis in private, he listened with a seriousness that felt too grown up for a boy his age, following every sentence closely. Then he stopped her at one line. He did not want the world to think he was merely doing better. He wanted, music, them to know he was getting strong again. It was a small distinction, but it mattered more to him than anyone realized. Catherine changed the sentence right there on the spot. Charles approved the final version with a handwritten note that would echo through everything that happened next. Music. He wrote that truth delivered with restraint protects the crown more honestly than silence ever could. The statement was approved, but approval on paper is not the same as saying the words out loud in front of a camera, knowing there would be no music second take. At the appointed hour, Catherine sat down with the palace's official script placed in music front of her. It was the same careful, distant version William had objected to weeks earlier. She read through it one final time. Then, music in front of the camera. She turned it face down on the table beside her. For a moment, Catherine said nothing at all, and the pause stretched just long enough that anyone watching could tell something had shifted. Then, she began speaking in her own words instead, exactly as she and William had agreed she would. Catherine started with the truth the palace draft had never once mentioned by name. Music Lewis had been fighting Asirius.